thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me here. And also, I know that it has been 2 long days, so thanks for coming this evening. And I'd like to thank especially Gabrielle, who has accepted to reply to my talk, and also to thank Judd and Jason, who's done an amazing job organizing this huge conference. And I'm really grateful to be here. So I would like to start today with a story that actually I borrow from Google. And that's a story that happens during the 19th century in St. Petersburg. And one day, a major wakes up and realizes that his nose has left him. So he wakes up, he has no nose. And he's puzzled, and he looks around, he can't find his nose. And he wanders around the city trying to find his nose. And eventually, he finds his nose, who seemed to have a life of his own. So, of course, he goes to the nose and says, okay, just come back now. I mean, you're my own nose. And the nose doesn't want to. And he said, why should I come back? And so the major replied, well, merely you are my own nose. The nose regarded the major and contracted its brows a little. My dear sir, you speak in error, was its reply. I am just myself separately. And I really like this story by Gogol, not only because I like Gogol, but also because I think that it just shows that this apparent simplicity of the relationships that we have with our own bodies, these bodies that we take for granted, actually, it might be more complicated than what we think. And I will see today, actually, we can even become alienated from our own body. So let me now turn to a second story. Still in the 19th century, still a story about a nose. It seems that it has attracted quite a lot of attention in literature, but this time from the French writer Edmond About. And this time, this is a story of a notary who just got his nose cut off. And he successfully grafted a bit of a poor water courier's arm skin to create a new nose. And the whole story is about what's happening to the nose. And the notary starts to realize that something bizarre is happening with his nose, and that what's happening to his nose actually correlates with what's happening to the water courier. So, for instance, when the water courier drank too much alcohol, then the notary's nose becomes all red. Or when the water courier starved, the nose dwindled away. And when eventually the water courier lost his arm from which a graft was made, the nose dropped off altogether. So this is more or less the reverse of the first story, because here it's a case where it's not about alienating your own body. It's rather the reverse. You embody another person's body and how it can work or cannot work sometimes. And again, we'll see that today, how in some circumstances one can feel that other external object can be part of one's body. So, as you can see, I mean, the relation between the body and the self is, at least according to me, fascinating. And I think this is well illustrated by this quotation from the philosopher Brian O'Shaughnessy. He says, now there is every reason for expecting it to be a highly unusual relation. For we are talking about the epistemological link between a man and, in all probability, himself qua material object. And in any case, the one object in the universe that is his own body. Is it not likely to be unusual? And I think I will agree with Brian O'Shaughnessy, and that's what I will try to explore today. But beforehand, I think it's quite important to make a few distinctions. You know, philosopher likes to make distinctions. And, but not only philosopher, luckily, also writers like to make distinction. And one important distinction is about different notions of the self. And I'm sure that it comes back again and again during this conference. And that's the idea that there may be more than one notion of the self, and this is well illustrated by this very short story by Borges, called Borges and I, and where more or less he described himself from a first person and a third person perspective. And he said, I quote, the other one, the one called Borges, is the one things happen to. I do not know which of us has written this page, and sometimes you can feel that there may be confusion between these two perspectives on oneself. And this, Borges' insight actually matched closely to a distinction found in philosophy that was made by Wittgenstein between what he calls the self as a subject and the self as an object. So the idea that Wittgenstein had is that there are some cases where clearly, for instance, when I say I am in pain, it does not make sense to ask me, are you sure you are the person in pain? I mean, you could not be mistaken about whose person is in pain when you feel in pain. However, and that will be the self as a subject. However, when you say, for instance, when I say I am Frédérique, well, it might be, maybe I'm just an impostor, maybe I'm amnesic, and I self-attributed this name, but I'm not Frédérique. And I could be wrong about who Frédérique is, and that's when there is this kind of error, what Wittgenstein called a self as an object. So that's a first distinction between different notions of the self, but not the only one. Here I will focus on the self as a subject, and I will now go to another distinction, and that's the idea of the self as the mind or the self as the body. I mean, we are all familiar with Descartes' cogito and this idea that the self is primarily a mental entity, something to which we ascribe emotion, desire, belief, emotion, intentions, but primarily mental states. On the other hand, one might argue, well, the self is also the body that embodies all these mental states. And the debate between these two notions of the self has been especially vivid when we talk about personal identity. So, for instance, Locke imagined that a prince could have all his memories and his experiences and personality put in a cobbler's body. And the question he had was, well, what is the output of this thought experiment? The man with the cobbler's body, but the prince's memories. Is it the prince or is it the cobbler? And here he replied, well, I will just read what he says. For sure the soul of a prince, carrying with it the consciousness of the prince's past life, enters and informs the body of a cobbler. As soon as deserted by his own soul, everyone sees he will be the same person with the prince, accountable only for the prince's action. So you can see here that Locke, in the debate between the self as a mind or the self as a body, argues in favor of the mind. Others have argued in favor of the body. And here I will focus, as you can expect, on the body. A last distinction about a different notion of the self is between the synchronic self and the diachronic self. When I talk about personal identity, more or less, I talk about the criterion that makes me the same person yesterday and today. So the self across time, and that's what Locke was interested in. But one might also wonder about the self right now, the self really here at time t. This self that just independently of what happened in the past or what will happen in the future, just what I experience right now as being mine. And in a way, if we draw a comparison with Oscar Wilde's famous novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, the idea would be, well, the diachronic self is something like the portrait himself, so something that can grow old. But what another notion of the self is just Dorian Gray himself and not his portrait. So what is really the self right now? That is a kind of eternal present. So again, I will be interested in the synchronic self. So just to recap, I'm interested in the self as a subject, the self as a body, and the synchronic self. But still, you can see, just drawing these small distinctions, that there are many, many questions that can be raised when one is interested in the relationship between the body and the self. And I'm just going to list a few of them, just to show the different perspectives that one can have on the relationship between the body and the self. So first, there are some ontological or metaphysical questions about the nature of the self and its relation to the body. For instance, am I a body or do I own a body? Or if I own a body, which body is mine? How do I decide which body is mine? I mean, that's ontological question, but you could also ask ethical and legal questions. I guess it's especially important now with scientific progress and medical progress. For instance, can one have property rights upon body parts? And if so, who owns the human body? Or can the body be commercialized like any object? So that's also a set of questions that you might want to raise. And then there are the more psychological question, that is there a phenomenology of my body, or what grants a sense of bodily ownership, or how is the sense of bodily ownership related to bodily sensation, action, and emotion? And can one feel ownership toward any object and not just one's body? So that's one set of questions. And the last set of questions is what we might call epistemological questions. So whether we can, how we can know that this is, for instance, our body. And that's the notion of immunity to errors from misidentification that is dear to philosophers, and that's the idea that can I be wrong when I say this is my body, for instance, when I feel it from the inside? And what will guarantee this immunity to this specific kind of error? So of course, I don't have the time here, and I don't have the expertise to address all these questions. So I will focus just on the psychological question for today. And finally, I promise that's the last set of distinction. After that, I will get into the real matter. So, and it's just, I'm going to talk about bodily ownership. And one should be really careful to distinguish between the fact of ownership and the sense of ownership. So the fact of ownership, more or less, it's almost a biological fact. This is my body, like, for instance, you could say, well, this is determined by my DNA or something like that, and that's based on a kind of objective criterion. While on the other hand, the sense of ownership is based on subjective criterion. And that's really the psychological self-awareness that I am aware of this body as mine, and what I want to study today is really this sense of ownership. And I'm not going to address the question of fact of ownership. I will just assume that this body belongs to Frédérique because it has the DNA of Frédérique or something like that. And within the sense of ownership, one has to distinguish two last things. You could, when you say, I am aware that this is my body, well, you could say, well, I know that. I have this belief. I know this is my body. That's the knowledge that I have about my body. But maybe there is something more than that. Maybe there is more than just a judgment about whose body it is. Maybe it's also something that I experience, that I feel from the inside, what we could call a feeling of ownership. And we will see that some philosophers have argued that all there is just judgment of ownership, and there is nothing it is like to feel this body as one's own. While I will argue there is a phenomenology of myness when it comes to the body. So let me describe a bit more what will be this theory that say, well, there's nothing like feeling of ownership. That's what they call themselves the deflationary view of ownership. And on their view, more or less, the be-all and end-all of the sense of body ownership is the fact that one feels bodily sensation. So roughly speaking, it will be something like, I am aware that this body is mine because that's where I feel sensation. Therefore, it must be mine, something like that. And that's all there is to the sense of ownership. In particular, there is nothing like a positive, qualitative, subjective experience of myness, which will go beyond the mere experience of one's bodily properties. So it's just about, so for instance, let's imagine that I have my finger crossed, then I have sensation of my finger crossed, but a part of the content of my sensation will be, okay, finger crossed, but there will be nothing that will be first personal. It will be just about finger and being crossed, and that's it. And based on this sensation, then I can derive that this is my body. This sensation can ground my sense of ownership. But there is, at the level of the experience itself, at the level of the bodily sensation itself, there will be nothing first personal. And two main representatives of this view are the philosophers Mike Martin and José Bermúdez. So what they say, I will just give you two quotes. So Mike said, what marks out a felt limb as one's own is not some special qualities that it has, but simply that one feels it in this way. A limb or a sensation count as apparently belonging to one's body, simply by being felt. So all there is to it is just feeling sensation. And José Bermúdez recently in 2011 said, the sense of ownership consists first in certain facts about the phenomenology of bodily sensation, and second, in certain fairly obvious judgment about the body, which we can term judgment of ownership. So as you can see, there is no room here for feeling of ownership. So just to defend the view that bodily sensation is quite important, well, intuitively, this view is very attractive, because if we consider the body from the outside, for instance, on the basis of vision, well, clearly, this cannot grant our sense of body ownership, because we see our body, but we see many bodies. Here, I guess I see something like 60 bodies in addition to my own body. So this cannot suffice by itself to grant the sense of ownership. And the philosopher, British philosopher Bill Brewer said, for instance, clearly, the question of how we experience our body as ours is not and cannot be an external perceptual phenomenon. For when we perceive it from the outside, that is based on vision, for instance, our body has no indelible stamp of ownership. It appears just as one object among many, although it is one whose feature we know very well. Yet, its being ours strikes us far more forcefully than the transferable contingency of anything we simply recognize perceptually as ours in an external way. So when we see it, there is nothing that strikes us as, this is my body. On the other hand, the thing is, we have a specific relation to our body, especially since we have this sensation from the inside. We experience the body not only through the 5 classic senses, but through all these bodily sensations and bodily experiences that we have. Like, for instance, I feel the resistance of the table, or the cups feel hot, or I feel my legs crossed, or I have a toothache, or I feel tired, and so on and so forth. So we have all these bodily sensations that give us a direct access only to our own body and to no other bodies. So this difference between perceiving our body and perceiving another person's body is not a mere quantitative difference. It's not only that we have more information about our body than about other bodies. It's rather that there is something more fundamental about it. And you could say that because there is this fundamental difference, this is susceptible to grant the sense of body ownership. So now I will present 4 arguments that have been put forward by the deflationary view. So I will not focus so much about whether bodily, it will be part of the talk whether bodily sensation grants the sense of ownership, but especially I want to see whether it's all there is to the sense of ownership, and maybe there might be something else, and especially what I call a feeling of ownership. So let's start with the argument from introspection. Well, the idea is very simple, more or less, when you try to introspect, and whether the question you can ask, any of us can ask, okay, when I feel sensation, do I feel minus, or is it just something that I know? Is that really a phenomenology of minus? And it seems that introspection is not so clear about that, and some people will say, well, I don't feel anything like a special feeling of minus. I know it's my body, but it's not something that I feel. However, the fact that there is no salient phenomenology of ownership, and I completely grant that, does not mean that there is no phenomenology at all. And especially since actually bodily awareness has its specificities, that most of the time it's quite elusive and recessive. I mean, we are aware first of the external world, the world with which we interact, rather than our body. And it's only when we pay attention to it, or when we are in pain, for instance, that the body becomes really at the foreground of our consciousness. But most of the time, it's just at the background. So the fact that there is no salient phenomenology of ownership could just reflect this fact. So let's turn now from a second argument that I call the argument from invariance. Well, you could say, since bodily sensation give access only to my own body, this is true actually, at least in our actual world, I mean, a lot of medical progress, but still, for now, the only body I can feel from the inside is my own body. Then why would I need to specify whose body it is? Because anyway, it's just mine. It cannot be any other bodies if I feel it that way. So it would be like a bit like if Robinson Crusoe was in an island, had to specify whose body it was. It's just his body. There are no other bodies around. So he doesn't need to say whose body it is. The problem with this argument is that I think it confused two things. It confused the fact of ownership and the sense of ownership. The fact that I can feel sensation only in my body, and I'm not going to deny that, does not necessarily imply that I am aware that this body is mine. As I say, I'm really at the psychological level. And at the psychological level, one can be wrong at this, whether this is my body or another body. So that's because there is this possibility of error. It is important to specify whose body it is. A third argument, what I call the argument from illusion, or maybe from the lack of illusion. So this argument was given by José Bermúdez. And roughly, his idea was there is no feeling of ownership, because when we try to describe it, we always end up describing a judgment of ownership. And there is never any dissociation between a feeling of ownership and a judgment of ownership. There is no independent way to access to the feeling of ownership that is not through the judgment of ownership. And therefore, because there is no independent access to it, there is no need to posit a feeling of ownership. All we have access is just a judgment of ownership, and that's all there is. And the problem with this argument is that it seems to be denied by an experiment that has been done that use a belief-independent illusion of bodily ownership. So as we will see now, one can feel a hand as one's own, and yet there be no illusion that the hand is one's own. So it's possible, against what Bermúdez says, it's possible to dissociate the feeling and the judgment of ownership. So what is this illusion? Well, now it has started to be quite famous, not only in psychology and neuroscience, but also in philosophy. It's called the rubber hand illusion. And it has been found something like 15 years ago, and since then it has become really the experimental tool to investigate the sense of body ownership. So how does it work? Well, roughly, you have participants who sit with their left arm resting on a table hidden behind a screen. And they are asked to look at a rubber hand in front of them. So they don't see their own hands, they see a rubber hand. And the experimenter strokes with two paintbrushes the unseen biological hand and the rubber hand. And it could be synchronous or asynchronous. And then what they found is that when you stroke the two hands in synchronous, then you start to experience the illusion. So what is the illusion exactly? Well, the first thing that subject notes is that they start feeling sensation on the rubber hand. So when they localize the sensation, they don't feel it on their own hand, they feel it on the rubber hand. And furthermore, and that's what interests us here, they report a sense of ownership. And so towards the rubber hand, they report as if the rubber hand were their own hand. They also, when you ask them to locate their own hand, they mislocalize it in the direction of the rubber hand. And finally, if you threaten or if you hit the rubber hand, then they have a strong affective reaction, as if it had been their own hand that was hit. So that's what is called the rubber hand illusion. So there are many versions of it, but I think one particular version is interesting. It's called the body swapping illusion. And the body swapping illusion, so it's slightly more complicated because the rubber hand illusion is just about about a hand, just one single body part that you self-attribute. While in the body swapping illusion, it's about the whole body. A further difficulty is that just technical, is that the rubber hand just involved, at the beginning, just involved actually a Halloween bloody rubber hand, while for the body swapping illusion, you need a whole system of virtual reality. So it's slightly more complicated, but this is how it works. So here on the picture, you can see the woman seated, that's the experimenter. And she wears a camera at the top of her head, and the subject, so the man standing, wear virtual reality goggles. So what happens is that on the basis of this device, he can see from the experimenter's visual perspective on his own body and on her own body. So he can see her body as if it were his own. And then they are asked to stand opposite to each other, and to take hold of the hand and to squeeze their hand like that. So more or less what he sees are two hands squeezing, but the hand that he sees from the first-person perspective is actually the experimental's hand. And because of this illusion, at one point, one subject reported, I was shaking hands with myself, because the subject ended attributing the experimental's body to himself. And when you threaten the experimental's hand, what happens is actually the subject has a stronger affective response than if it is his own hand that is threatened. So it seems really that the subject has appropriated the experimental's body. So here we have the case of two ownership illusion. And clearly here we have a case where subject knows very well that this is just a rubber hand. I mean, there is no doubt about it. And they also know that they are wearing a virtual reality system, so they know that it's not their own body. But still, they can feel as if it were their own hand or as if their own body. And Chris Peacock, here from Columbia, describes this whole phenomenon as follows. Hands being experienced as yours is part of the phenomenology of ordinary human experience. As elsewhere, this phenomenology should not be identified with any kind of judgment that's mine. That judgment is not made in this illusion. In fact, it is rejected. When a subject knows that he is experiencing the rubber hand illusion, but he still experiences the rubber hand as he is. So here, contrary to what Bermudez says, we have clearly a case where we can have access to the feeling independently of the judgment. So the proponent of the deflationary view could reply, well, this illusion are actually in favor of our view because you have a case where you feel sensation on the rubber hand and you have a sense of ownership towards the rubber hand. So that means that bodily sensation is just what matters for the sense of ownership. However, and maybe surprisingly, Bermudez rejects completely the whole illusion. So what he wants to say is that he denies the fact that the subject have a sense of ownership towards the rubber hand. Because according to him, you cannot localize sensation beyond the biological boundaries of one's body. He says, I quote, this will contravene the descriptive fact that feelings and sensation are experienced only within the confines of the body. And this is actually quite surprising because how can you account, for instance, for the case of phantom limb? We know that people who have been amputated still feel sensation in a phantom limb. And here clearly the sensation is localized beyond the boundary of the body and still we can localize sensations there. So it does not seem, Bermudez's reply does not work, I think. An alternative reply could be to say, well, it's just that they describe, like we say, as if they describe feelings, the subject who experience the rubber hand illusion. But is it really feelings? Or maybe actually what's happening is that they have a judgment of ownership that they are making and not a feeling that they are reporting. And indeed, it's not always clear whether they report feeling or judgment. So you could say, well, we should not interpret this situation as it feels like my hand, but it's not my hand. It will be just like, I believe that it's my hand, but on the other hand, I'm not so sure about it, but it will be just all about belief. Well, that's true that it's very hard to rule out. On the other hand, we might want to take the subject at their word when they say that they feel like their hand. And for instance, when they are asked to report what they experience, it's always like statements like, it seemed like the rubber hand, or it seemed like the rubber hand was my hand, or it seemed like the rubber hand was part of my body. It was just about seeming and appearances, and no subject is delusional about it. And also, the fact that it seemed to be quite primary and low level, the fact that they can have this affective reaction, seems to indicate that it's not so much about something kind of high-level cognitive, but something more at a primary level. So I think that also it's true that we might say, well, it's just judgment. There is no reason, at least, to say that it's judgment. But I want now to consider a last argument in favor of the deflationary view. And that's an argument made by Mark Martin. And he said, I quote, "If the sense of ownership is a positive quality over and above the felt quality of the sensation and the location, that there is a hurt in an ankle, for example, then it should be conceivable that some sensation lacks this extra quality while continuing to possess the other features. Just as we conceive of cold as a converse quality of warmth, could we also not conceive of a converse quality of a sensation location such that one might feel pain in an ankle not positively felt to belong to one's own body?" And he wants to say, well, that's not possible. So more or less, his argument is a kind of reduction ad absurdum. So how does it work? Well, according to his view, if the sense of ownership is a positive quality over and above, then it should be conceivable to have a sensation that is not positively felt to belong to one's body. This is inconceivable, therefore, there is no sense of ownership over and above bodily sensation. So that's his argument. And actually, what I'm going to show now is that he's wrong when he says this is inconceivable. Actually, this happens in reality. So this is a failed reduction ad absurdum. In a way, he just gives me an argument in favor of the feeling of ownership. And I mean, there's this famous quote from Dickens from Hard Times, where from when Mrs. Gradgrin said, "I think there's a pen somewhere in the room, but I couldn't positively say that I have got it." Well, I want to say that this cannot be found only in literature, but also actually for anybody here and also in some patients with neurological disorder. So in some cases, one can feel sensation with no sense of ownership. And in other cases, one can feel sensation in a body part that feels alien. And therefore, this seems to be exactly what Martin said it's inconceivable. Because it's conceivable, I would say, that the sense of ownership in his own world is a positive quality over and above. So let me start with a very basic intuition, and that's the question about how we experience the different parts of our body. I mean, I've talked about the hand mainly, but there seem to be, as William James says, certain part of the body seems more intimately ours than the rest. And Brian O'Shaughnessy also says, while my gallbladder is a part of me that I know exists, my leg is that and more. So there seems to be a phenomenological difference between our body parts, whether they are like limbs or effectors, or whether they are like internal organs. And one way to put this phenomenological difference is like, we know that this is our stomach. That's something that we know. But that's not something that we feel. Why we feel that this hand is ours. So that will be a difference between the two. And it's interesting that in some languages, actually, in Australasian Island, they do not use the same possessive pronoun, depending on the body parts. So for the internal organs, they will use a different pronoun than for the hand or the leg when it comes to a possessive pronoun. So I think it seems to reflect the same intuition. Another case where we will have, so for the stomach, I will say, well, the stomach, we have sensation. We can have terrible pain, stomach pain, but still no feeling of ownership. Another case where we can have sensation but no feeling of ownership is, I think, in the case of tools. And again, I would like to use a very nice quotation from one from Butler. I saw that there was one talk today about it. And so, but I think it's just, I mean, quite striking. So the lower animals keep all their limbs at home in their own bodies. But many of man's are loose and lie about detached, now here and now there, in various parts of the world, some being kept always handy for contingent use, and others being occasionally hundreds of miles away. A machine is merely a supplementary limb. This is a be-all and end-all of machinery. We do not use our own limbs other than as machines. And a leg is only a much better wooden leg than anyone can manufacture. Observe a man digging with a spade. His right forearm has become artificially lengthened, and his hand has become a joint. And what is interesting is indeed that there is this intuition that tools can be part of the body, can be embodied. And we can feel sensation at the tip of a tool. And like Lotze, also in the physiologist Lotze said, Pen and brush will be clumsy instruments in the hand of the clerk or the painter if we did not directly feel their contact with the paper. Knife and fork will fail in part of the office if we were aware only of the position of the handle in our hand, and not at the same time of the incision made in the objects by the blade and bronze. So further does the woodcutter feel, along with the axe's reaction against his hand, its hissing cleaving of the wood. So does the soldier feel his weapon piercing the flesh of his antagonist. We can see that we are in the 19th century. But the point is that we have sensation, and still we don't have ownership. I mean, when you use your fork and knife for dinner, you do not feel that the fork and the knife belong to your own body, as your own hand feels. And you might feel the resistance, for instance, of the steak, but still you do not feel that this knife is your own, is your own body. Nor do you behave in a way that indicates awareness of the knife and fork as a part of your body. So typically, you put a spoon to stir a pot of boiling soup instead of your finger. I mean, you will never do that because you will harm yourself, but you don't care about the spoon, which shows that it's not fully embodied. Okay, you might feel sensation, but you do not fully appropriate it as if it were a part of your body. So here again, I think we have a case where we have sensation, but no ownership. So to reply to Mike Martin, you will say, well, look, bodily sensation cannot be the be-all and end-all of the sense of ownership because you can have sensation without ownership. Then he could reply, well, but that's not what I have in mind when I talk about bodily sensation. You're talking about very specific bodily sensation, like bodily sensation for internal organs or bodily sensation on tools. That's not exactly the kind of bodily sensation I have in mind. So then, and also he could reply, well, also, I mean, I was talking about really not feeling the part as alien, not only having no sense of ownership, but having a sense of disownership. And there is no such thing, according to him, as a sense of disownership. However, this is not true. And again, a quotation from the famous neurologist Oliver Sacks, who had an accident and who had his leg in a cast for several months, and after that, he felt completely alienated with his leg, and he reported in very vivid terms. In that instance, that very first encounter, just after the cast was removed, I knew not my leg. It was utterly strange, not mine and familiar. I gazed upon it with absolute non-recognition. The more I gazed at that cylinder of chalk, the more alien and incompressible it appeared to me. I could no longer feel it as mine, as part of me. It seemed to bear no relation whatever to me. It was absolutely not me, and yet, impossibly, it was attached to me, and even more impossibly continuous with me. So we have cases of sense of disownership, like this case. Another possible case where you find disownership is in the psychiatric syndrome of depersonalization, where patients report abnormal bodily sensation, including a sensation that their body parts are not their own. For instance, one patient reported, I don't know who I am, of course I am, such and such, but I feel like a robot, like I'm listening to someone else talking, like I'm looking at myself from the outside. But it is not another voice or body, it's mine, it's me, just it doesn't feel like it. Another patient, my hand do not seem to be mine, the top part of my head often seems to disappear. So again, that's another case where patient can feel disownership. But it can go, this disownership sensation can go very far and have extreme consequences, like in the syndrome of body integrity identity disorder. So in this case, patient reports that there is a body that does not belong to them, and they feel it to such an extent that they want to get amputated from this specific body part that feels alien. And if it's not, they will go to the doctor, to surgeon to ask for surgery. If it's prohibited, like it is in the UK, they will try to do it themselves, like going to very extreme situation. And when eventually they are amputated, then they feel relieved and they feel that now their body looks how it should look. So for instance, one patient reported, my left foot was not part of me. I didn't understand why, but I knew I don't want my leg. And these patients, their body was perfectly okay, so they didn't have any motor disorder, no sensory disorder, nothing. Another patient, I feel like an amputee with natural prosthesis. They are my legs, but I want to get rid of them. They don't fit my body image. Another one, I don't understand where it comes from or what it is. I just don't want legs. Inside, I feel that my legs don't belong to me. They shouldn't be there. At best, my legs seem extraneous. I will almost say as if they are not part of me. Also, I feel them, I see them, I know they are. So again, we have a case of an extremely vivid sense of disownership. And the last case is a neurological syndrome of somatoparaphrenia that occurs after lesion of the parietal cortex. And this patient, what they report is that quite often they report that their left hand is not their own. And for instance, one patient, so the examiner, close your eyes and tell me what you feel when I'm touching your hand. That's not my hand, it's not mine, someone left it there. I don't know who he was, I don't know who attached it to my body. Isn't it a little bit weird to have a foreign hand with you? No, my hand is not like this. And another patient, if this hand is not yours, can I take it away with me? Of course, if you want it. I will give it to you as my gift since I have no need for it. Do you want to move this hand away? Wouldn't you be sad without it? Yes, if it was mine, but it's not. So again, they can this very vivid delusion. This is not the hand, it does not feel like the hand, it feels alien. So you could say, well, in this case, it's just like maybe they just don't have bodily sensation. And maybe it happened to you to wake up in the middle of the night and you feel your arm completely numb and anesthetized and like it feels like a piece of food and it feels almost alien, so something that more or less happened to all of us. But in this case, typically it's because you have had no bodily sensation in the hand, and that's why it feels alien. And you could say that in general it's true that sensory loss, like anesthesia, could induce a sense of disownership. Or you could say, well, like patients with depersonalization disorder, they have abnormal bodily sensation, that's why they've lost this sense of ownership. And that would be really consistent with the deflationary view. If you have no sensation, then you have no sense of ownership. Makes sense. However, of course, it's not that easy. And if you look, for instance, at a patient with body identity integrity disorder, they do have bodily sensation, since they have disownership. Okay, well, you could say, well, they are very special case, maybe, we don't know exactly what's going on with them. But still, you can look at the patient with brain lesions that have somatoparaphrenia. And what has been shown is that actually this patient can feel pain or they can feel touch. So for instance, two of these patients in a study were 100% accurate to report whether they were touched or not. So they have tactile sensation. And when asked how was it possible for them to have tactile sensation in a hand they deny as their own, when one patient reported many strange things can happen in life. Well, they are a bit delusional. But still, what is interesting here is that if we use Mike Martin's word, this patient feel touch in a hand not positively felt to belong to their own body. So that's exactly the kind of case that Mike Martin said was not conceivable. So I think that is a good argument to claim that bodily sensation cannot be the whole story about the sense of ownership. There is not just that, there is something else. So to conclude, I have argued that the sense of ownership is not just about bodily sensation, and it's not just about judgment of ownership. My hand seems to be manifested to me in a more primitive form than belief or judgment. And one way to account for this difference is in terms of feeling of ownership. There is something it is like to experience my hand as my own, some kind of non-conceptual intuitive awareness of ownership. And if you agree with that, then you have two possible alternatives. So either you say, well, you have this kind of inflationary view where we say, okay, there is this feeling of body ownership. That's it. I've explained everything. That's not a kind of irreducible subjective feature of bodily awareness, and that's the end of the story. Or you could try a reductionist view, and that would be to say, okay, there is this feeling of ownership, but this feeling itself has its source in some fundamental facts about the way the body is represented in the mind. Of course, then you have to say which facts and how they grant body ownership. And that will be the story for another talk. So thanks a lot.
So for Frédérique, that was wonderful. Thank you very much for a really engaging talk that I think has raises some questions that have significant ripple effects outward. So what I'd like to do a little bit is to quickly indicate some of what I think are the main points in the landscape, and then maybe we can think together as a group about these and all the other issues that Frédérique's talk raised. And one thing that I'd like to point out is that at the end, with her two alternatives, she has left us with one possibility that actually is subject to empirical examination, and one possibility that is unlikely ever to come to such. And that's something important to keep in mind. Now, so let's first get to a rather partial summary of what I think are key takeaways from this talk. So I think we've seen several interesting things. First, we know convincingly that the sense of ownership in individual body parts can be dissociated from sensations, from actual sensations of touch, and this is really clear in the rubber hand experiment. And we have individuals who locate sensations in a place external to their own proper bodies. Second, we also know that there are cases where we can dissociate from the body pathologically, and we just saw that with somatoparaphrenia, but schizophrenics also experience the rubber hand illusion differently, and there are cases in which dissociation is linked to trauma, right? And this can be something like post-traumatic stress disorder, or it can be for survivors of rape or torture. And that they feel that the sensory experience that they have had is somehow necessarily alien to their core self. And I think that it's important to realize that that kind of dissociation sometimes can be willed and intentional, as well as something that comes from the outside with something like post-traumatic stress, but that it can also be available through practice. And this is something that we can think about with the various kinds of meditative practices. And the fact that you can have willed and intentional dissociation from the body that can be tested shouldn't be ignored as we think about phenomenon of body ownership. And this also leads me to think that we can discover more beyond the sort of virtual reality goggle experiments that you see with the body swapping. I love that body swapping idea condition, but that we can think more about ways that we can use gaming or immersive practices of reading to think about these not just body ownership, but what's happening in these other practices. And for those of us who think about literature on a regular basis, I think there's some productive places there to focus. Now, another key thing that Frédérique pointed out was that we have this very weak sense of body ownership, that it's weak and it's also weakly constant, that it's intermittent in some ways. But often body ownership tends to emerge by surprise or in response to some kinds of threat. And the rubber hand experiment is a good place where we see that the threat of the hammer coming down is the thing which can bring the question of ownership into quick view. But we also see this when you pass by a plate glass window, right, and you are taken aback that that person seems to be moving at the same rate that you are, and then you realize, oh, it's me, just fatter and older than I thought I was. And you also see this in a crowded room where you misattribute your body to somebody else's, and you can see this in reflections. But these examples get to a point, and I think we see these with the examples that Frédérique gave as well, where there's probably a hierarchy of sensation by sensory perceptions by which we would want to think about these phenomena of body ownership. And we've seen some examples of vision, and I'll come back to those in a minute. But we also can think about sound and voice as being two different kinds of hallmarks for body ownership in different ways. And I will take a much less lofty literary example, which is what I've been reading in the bathtub late at night recently, The Lord of the Rings. right, where we have Gollum's patter of the feet behind the company that slowly makes them realize that there is a body that is not their own that's moving with them. But that is, sound seems to have a different sort of relationship to our bodily configurations, and that it's when sound approaches touch that it becomes much more real. And so we can think about Roland Barthes and his discussion of what exactly a voice and accent are, and that internal resonance of voice being one way in which actually something that belongs to an internal organ, which would be the resonance within the larynx and inside the stomach and throughout the torso, helps us in our identifications of body ownership. So we would want to separate out different sensory modalities when we think about it. But vision certainly seems to be key in some of these illusions, even though vision, as Frédérique points out, is not enough in order to give us a reliable attribution of body ownership or even that sensation. So that visual dominance is really important in the body swapping illusion, and that there's a period of training that you go through in the rubber hand experiment, whereby you are conditioned to associate the touch that you see with and feel, and the touch that you feel. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but I want to stick with this for just one moment because I think it gets us again to some interesting sub-questions about these internal organs and how it is that we experience them as ours or not ours. And I gave the example of the voice as being one way in which our body becomes physically real to us. But we also might think of the enteric nervous system and the way in which we can, our gut emotions, to take Jesse Prince's term, can seem to emanate from this body that is within us, all the nerves around our stomach and our entrails. And folks like Michael Gershon and Christoph Koch will argue that it's possible, faintly possible, Koch will argue, that there might be another mind, right, that's in the middle of our stomachs, and that is thinking along with us, but in different ways. Now, it turns out that the somatosensory and the motor homunculi, the regions right and the kind of parietal cortex that help us to map touch as well as sensation and motion onto our body parts, they don't include most of our internal organs. And that's one way that we could begin to think about what some of the differences and the irreducibles that come down to what we're willing to call ours in this particularly felt sense and what we're willing to judge as ours in the knowledge sense. They seem to be different. Now, as a last example to throw in that might twist our images a little more is to think about sexual organs, right, and orifices in which we are much more likely to attribute ownership than we are to stomachs or to guts. And that's certainly a physiological question of innervation, but it also is a cultural question about how it is that we value certain kinds of inner spaces and others we do not. Now, the last point that I'd like to raise has to do with how the sense of ownership might be constructed. And here I want to return for a moment to the rubber hand illusion. So I said we have this training period in which subjects see the hand and feel actual touch on their own skin simultaneously. And the training phase, essentially, it's training expectations, right? So that you're having a conditioned stimulus whereby you're associating what you see with what you feel. But I think in a different context, we'd say that this experiment shows, in fact, the conditioned production of imagery rather than conditioned production of sensation. And I think that's worth thinking about and trying to disaggregate. So that in that view, there would be three kinds of imagery there. There'd be the imagery of touch, but there also would be a proprioceptive imagery about the position in which the hand is situated, as well as this kind of anticipatory imagery of pain, right, that you imagine what is going to come. And I actually think that there's a large part of our phenomenology of ownership that is, in fact, imaginative. And I mean that in a similar way to what Hume did when he says that the self is imaginary because it's discontinuous and we have to edit and construct it and stitch things together. And Frédérique has pointed out that we have our ways in which our sense of bodily ownership actually edits all sorts of things out, right? That we don't feel, most of you don't feel the cloth on the side of your body, you don't feel the bottom of your shoe against your foot most of the time. It's only when it becomes an irritant or particularly pleasurable that it enters in, allows you to construct a sense of bodily ownership around that sensation. But I also want to point out the way in which we edit things in imaginatively into our sense of bodily ownership. So Atnevan Farrar point out that the visual world behind the head is a really constitutive part of our proprioceptive position, that all of you right now are aware, in large part, the fact that there are people behind you, their seats ranked behind you, the doors and emergency exits that way, so that our visual life and our proprioceptive life are being constantly edited by imaginative kinds of interventions, because we exist in this 3D space in which the occlusion of the world by our bodies, even if it's the back of our head, has to be made up for, and we embroider with imagined vision all the time. The fact that vision is so closely linked in our sense of self to what's fundamentally invisible at any one point, the world on the other side of the body, on the back side of the body, is something we should take into account when we're discussing something like the rubber hand illusion. Now, we've learned in recent years that the neural mechanisms that underlie imagery are largely coextensive with the neural mechanisms that underlie much of the neural processing that goes into our sense of self. And particularly here, this would be the set of networked reasons called the default mode network, which do all sorts of things, but they have to do with monitoring of bodily sensation and position, imagined projections of self in time or in space, with theory of mind in the minds of others, identifications of values and of valued experiences, including intense aesthetic ones. And it's here, I think, that we might begin to disentangle some of the measurable components of a core set of systems for bodily ownership, if really the reductionist view is the one that we might explore. Now, one way that we might be able to do this would be through intervening through something like TMS, which is cranial magnetic stimulation, where you interfere locally with the ability of a neuron to fire, to generate an action potential, and that you can interfere with that in a way that can disrupt your somatosensory perception, or you can work with people who have defects in their ability to have the kinds of connections in the default mode network that underlie imaginative experience, and that might be one way that you could separate some of these things out. I've now tipped my hand, which is that I think the reductionist view, God help me, is probably the right one. But if it's not, there are ways that we could find out at some point in the future. So I think these things are testable, and I think you've left us with two interesting possibilities, and maybe we can have more conversation. So.
I'd like to think more about this idea that imagery could play an important role, and especially since bodily imagery might be less easy to imagine in a way. Like when you say visual imagery, you can see what it's like, more or less. It's easy. If I ask you to have imagery based on bodily sensation, then quite often it seems that we fall down to visual imagery, and we visualize our body rather than we, I don't know what would be the term, we would have a tactile imagery. Tactile imagery, it's not so easy what it's like to have tactile imagery or what it's like to have pen imagery. You can imagine, but is it really something that you feel to the same extent as you do when you have visual imagery? I don't know, but I think it's a fascinating suggestion that there could be something, part of imagination could play a role for the sense of body ownership, and I would love to discuss more with you.
But one of the things that I think is important is that when I talk about visual imagery, I was also suggesting that visual imagery is more than purely visual, right? That it carries with it this potential for haptic imagery in terms of the way that we grasp things, the positions of our body, the fact, it depends on if you ask people to imagine themselves moving or imagine someone else moving, that there's motor imagery that goes along with self-imagery that often is not the case when you imagine what someone else is doing, and that you could create, in some ways, I think, at least first a descriptive analog of what an imagined body might be. And that's one way in which literary artifacts can help us to put together what the profile of an imagined body is and how you would know that it's yours and not somebody else's. And there, the question of genre, I think, becomes really important, because you can imagine touch all the time in erotic literature, right? You can begin to disentangle some of those things in that way.
I have read interviews with conjoined twins, and I'm not sure exactly what my question is here, but I'd just like to put it out there on the table. I've one sister feels it and understands the sensation, but knows it's the sister's arm that itches. And I'm just wondering, of course that complicates this question of ownership and feeling, but what does the fact that this experience exists in the world of our subjects, what does that say about maybe the limits of ownership, or what we don't know about ownership, or
Yeah, no, it raises a very interesting question. Of course, in this case, it's not clear what the fact of ownership is. So whether, but that's why at the psychological level, it raises many interesting questions. Among them, there is a question, I don't know in this specific case, but one thing I didn't talk about was about action and whether we have control over the body that could play a role in addition to bodily sensation. One interesting question would be for, in this specific case, do they have control over the whole body? The two sisters have control over the whole body, or they have control only on some part of it, and whether it makes a difference for their ownership. Also, another interesting question I think this specific case raises is, in a way, how many hands can we embody? Like in the case of the rubber hand illusion, it seems as if, so okay, you have your two own hands plus the rubber hand. Does it mean that we can feel as our own three hands, which seems to go against everything we've learned since we were born? Or some people would argue, for instance, in the case of the rubber hand illusion, that it's not that we feel as if we had three hands. It's rather that the rubber hand replaces the biological hand. So are there limits, as you say, are there limits to how many limbs we can embody, for instance, or we can feel ownership to? And that's partly an empirical question, and I don't think we have yet the answer. That's still a whole field to explore.
So I used to kind of continue to open up this term of ownership. Ownership is a very specific socio-historical mode of relatedness. And it's not unrelated to, for example, like capitalist social formations. It's not unrelated to kind of modes of ownership, domination, subordination, whatever. Sure. So my question is really working with ownership as a starting place, not relatedness, but you're working at ownership, which is a specific case of relatedness. And I'm wondering why start there with the specific case and not the general case, one, and two, if that would structure your inquiries in ways that would possibly restrict the outcome, or two, three, kind of enhance or make, but that's it.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understood everything, but let me give it a try. So I guess, well, that's why at the beginning I make all this distinction about the self. It was not just to annoy you, but really because I think what I'm interested in is in very minimal notion of the self. It's a kind of the simplest experience of the self. And I think that that's why I start with ownership, because I think that ownership is really at the minimal stage, and there is nothing more primary than ownership. If it has to be first personal, because relatedness does not need to be first personal. If you want to talk about self-consciousness or self-awareness, and I'm not talking about something reflexive at all, I'm really talking about something quite intuitive, then I will say that, so something very basic, something first personal, then I will say that the most minimal form is ownership, and that's why I start there. But maybe I didn't understand everything.
Just the idea is that the idea of ownership itself changes depending on the historical context that you're in.
I would not say that it changes. I would say that what I'm describing is independent of culture. I would say that it's a universal. And I know that can be provocative sometimes to say that there are universal facts. But I think that we will all agree that at least the organization of the brain is common to a large part to all culture, and that we have a primary somatosensory cortex, and that we have visual areas, and that they interact together, and that we have action over the body. That's all basic facts about the human body in general. And I think this is independent of culture, and there are facts that are independent of culture in the same way than when I say that being in pain, feeling pain, is, I would say, universal. And I think that it's like feeling pain, ownership, this primitive, non-conceptual awareness of myness will be universal. And after that, of course, you can have a more complex and reflexive sense of ownership that could be influenced by culture and beliefs. And for instance, you could imagine that in some culture or some religion where they believe that the God can possess your own body and just direct your movement, of course it will affect the way you relate to your body. But that will be at a different level. And I think that still at a primary level, there will still be this myness, this fact that when you are threatened, you just react. Because that's part more or less of our evolution, that we have been designed in such a way that we want self-preservation, and self-preservation means preservation of the body. And because of that, I would say that we have this minimal sense of ownership. And I will be inclined to say that to some extent, some animals share it with us. I mean, it's not like it will be only human. But I agree that it can be quite controversial.
I mean, I would say two things there. One, that certainly there is a minimal sense, that minimal sense of ownership you could describe to a single-celled organism, right? That, and that way it would be, the simplest question there is whether or not there are reward responses, right? Whether you seek to avoid something or seek to obtain something. And you can do that with ions, with amoebas, right? And concentrations, and that as a minimal sense doesn't even have to necessarily have any kind of consciousness along with it. But I think where it becomes more complicated is that even the minimal sense of ownership that most of us talk about with body ownership is implicated certainly in consciousness for us, and that then when we look at the particular kinds of examples that we've been looking at today, there are ways in which in a different version of this that Frédérique shared with me, that there's the fact that monkeys do not have the same kind, should not be subject to the rubber hand illusion, in part because they don't have as a developed external sense of visual sense of self in the same way that other mammals do. And they tend not to have mirror responses in the exact same way that human beings do. And so there is that sense. We already know that there's something more than a purely minimal sense of ownership, I think, that's at stake. But I also think that I agree with you in that the question of ownership is probably prior to the relational for most mature adults, once you're past maybe 18 months. And that it is your sense of self as an independent object whereby you can identify your own body image is pretty complete, and it's very hard, I think, to revert to a moment where the relationship is prioritized.
Just to give, because Gabrielle was talking about the infant, and I think it's a good example to illustrate why it will be universal and not dependent on culture. I mean, we know that babies, something like 6 or 9 months old, are able to recognize when they see their legs moving, so on a video screen, and they are able to recognize whether it's their own legs that are moving or not. So this is the kind of ownership I'm talking about. And of course, as you can imagine, we are really at a pre-verbal stage. There is, awareness is developed, but still only a little bit. They have sensation, and they have control over the body, but they don't have much than that. So here you have these babies, and they are able to make the difference when they see another baby's leg moving and their own legs moving. And that's what I was talking about today. But of course, it's not to deny that there are later stages or later levels of ownership that are more developed and influenced by culture, but it's just, I'm at the very beginning. I think that it's only if you have a good grasp of what is common to everybody, what's the kind of foundation of self-awareness. And after that, you can build upon the foundation, but you need the foundation first.
it's too big. Okay, we talked about bodily ownership. What about mind ownership? Do we consider that our mind belongs to us? And if yes, what about memory loss and Alzheimer and dementia, when person completely lose their memory and almost their mind and still consider their bodies?
Yeah, well, actually, indeed, people talk a lot about the sense of ownership for thoughts. And the idea is that you can find the same kind of dissociation that the one I described today, for instance, in schizophrenia, in the delusion of thought insertion. So schizophrenic patients report that they feel as if thoughts are being inserted into their mind, that's not their own thoughts, that's someone else's thought, or their mind is like a screen onto which other people's thoughts are projected. And then there is a debate in the case of thoughts, is that you could also imagine that it's not only about something that you have, but it's also things that you do. It's a kind of mental action. So people talk about both a sense of ownership and the sense of agency for thoughts. And typically, in the case of this delusion of thought insertion, people will say, well, patients still have access to this thought within their stream of consciousness. So because it's within, they can feel them from the inside, so it's still their own. But they don't feel that they are the author of this thought. So what is impaired is not ownership, but agency. So that might be a slight difference with the body, is that here it's a lot about that's the thought that you produce yourself, and there is this agency component that is quite important as well.
I'm wondering if you've come across any research in cognitive neuroscience on how some of these things differ by race, gender, class, these kinds of things, because it does seem like even something like bodily awareness might differ along those lines. When Dr. Starr was talking about like a sense of the body being irritated and like that's when we become aware of the physical self, it seems like that's going to be a lot different for people who occupy different spaces in the social structure. People who experience, I don't know, violence or oppression in their daily lives. Like I feel like they would have like more of a physical sense of their own bodies, and even maybe a different sense of ownership. I'm just wondering if in having neuroscience, if there's anything that might approach a disability study kind of model.
Not directly. The only studies that have been done are about interoception. So the interoception is our ability to pay attention more or less to our gut feelings, like our heart or respiration or things like that. And it seems that there are some people that are highly interoceptive, so very good in interoception, so in paying attention to internal signal from the body, and other people that are terribly bad. So you have more or less two categories of people, and it has been shown, for instance, that in the case of the rubber hand illusion, they are less influenced by the illusion. The people who are very good in interoception, and the idea would be, well, because they are so good in listening to bodily signals, they do not get the influence of vision to the same extent. Of course, after that, you can wonder whether they are good or bad in interoception, maybe because of the context, or maybe because indeed they are in a situation where they have to pay attention to their body all the time. And it's only anecdotal, but what I know is like, it's a kind of case, so you could imagine like bodily experts, like dancers, whether they would be better or worse in this kind of task, and it seems that actually when you have bodily illusions that rely heavily on internal bodily signals, they experience the illusion more strongly because they are so used to pay attention to their bodily signals, while when it's about vision, then they will be less good. So they will, it's not less good, but they experience less the illusion. So that's what I know, but I mean, it's not like directly studying whether there would be like categories of people that would have different things. But you can expect that at least it could be mediated by this idea that you are more or less good to pay attention to your bodily signals. And that can, of course, depend on the context. But maybe you know...
Well, I think now there's more attention that's being paid to individual differences in terms of whether it's abilities or training. In past, it was much more in terms of trauma and various kinds of pathological conditions. So that in some ways you could say that the whole idea of double dissociation comes out of a disability model, right, in which you're testing those who have a particular lesion or some other form of neural failures of connection against people who do not. But you know, two things about that. I don't think that the general point that Frédérique was making about the ability of your ability to edit things out or edit things in, I don't think that changes, because that seems to be, for the most part, fundamentally available to all of us, and indeed even necessary for proper functioning, right? You think about Middlemarch, right? If we had to hear all those crickets we're stepping on, we would go insane. But there are possibilities that you could do work, for example, with people who are returning home from Afghanistan, and see what kinds of sense of bodily ownership they have. That's very difficult to get permission to do that kind of work, but it's certainly possible.
I'm wondering, this might be outside of the scope of your research, but I'm wondering about if you've seen anything about differing conceptions of bodily ownership depending on differing early childhood or infancy experience, particularly differences between children who are maybe, I don't want to say like completely neglected, like feral children or something like that, but who are more or less affirmed physically or verbally in early childhood, like the first year.
So I'm not an expert at all in that. All I know is that there's more and more work now done on affective touch and on the role of affective touch for the development of cognitive abilities. So it seems that if you are, so what by affective touch I mean like stroking or things like that, or cuddling, or all this bodily sensation, and it seems that when an infant has received a lot of affective touch, he will develop better cognitive abilities than people, I mean children that have less. I mean, I can, if you want, I can give you reference to papers on that, but again, I'm not an expert on that.
Maybe one or two more, or one up here?
I just had a question going back, Frédérique, to what you're talking about with individuals who have better interoception. Has there been any studies looking at the relationship to this sort of enhanced interoception and an enhanced sense of ownership of the body? Since, I mean, in some senses, interoception and other sort of involuntary systems are kind of segregated in the mind, and so it would seem that you might not even be able to claim ownership over some of the more basal functions that are going on in the body.
Yeah, so two things. First, I agree that it's not, I mean, so interoception is really, I mean, the problem is that interoception is a very vague term. So it's now has become more and more popular and more people work on that. But it's still not clear exactly what we measure when we measure interoception. So is it just about gut reaction and visceral feelings? Or is it more about just the ability to pay attention to our bodily signals? That would be more generic quality. And so that's one difficulty, that to answer your question. A second difficulty is that it's very difficult to see how to measure the sense of ownership. So I've described the rubber hand illusion, but actually, I mean, to find a good, so you could have questionnaires, introspective reports, but we all know the limits of these questionnaires. So you could say, well, you want behavioral correlate of ownership. And for instance, affective reaction seems to be a good candidate. On the other hand, we know that when we empathize with someone else, we have also strong affective reaction. That's the whole point about empathy. So is it really self-specific or not? So it's not clear. So to see whether people will have a heightened, better sense of ownership will be very difficult to decide because we don't know yet really how to measure it. We have some hints, some clues, but they are not completely univocal. So sometimes, so I think at this stage we still need to work more to try to find good experimental design to assess the sense of ownership.
Do we have one last pressing question, and then we'll move upstairs?
Very short question. I'm just wondering if you could speak to what the conversation is. I guess the conversation about methodology that's happening between philosophy and neuroscience. Like, how does philosophy?
That's a short question.
Yeah, and experimental psychology, because like the similarity between your work and Jesse Prinz is that sort of reliance on the experimental.
Yeah, well, for me it has always been a twofold relationship. So on the one hand, I think, there is a lot of experimental data and with lots of insight in it. But sometimes the terminology is not clear, the concept they use is not clear, they don't always know what they mean, or they disagree with each other in the definition. So I think that one part of the job of a philosopher is just to clarify concepts and to make conceptual distinction and things like that, just to have a better grasp of what's going on. And so that's how philosophers can help psychologists or neurocognitive scientists. On the other hand, they also help philosophers because in a way, we all ask the same question. If you are a philosopher of mind, as I am, I have exactly the same object of study as psychologists and cognitive neuroscientists. So we raise the same question. We have different approaches, but we raise the same question. And their answer are, of course, very useful to guide the theory I want to develop. I don't think that they could be the end point, or because it will be very dangerous to completely trust science. Not in the sense that science is bad, but it's in constant progress. And it's quite interesting, like looking at the rubber hand illusion. So first study in 1998. Since then, there have been something like 100 studies. And results that were published in 2005, you had some other results that will just say, oh, okay, what was published in 2005 was wrong. Actually, we found out that now this is possible or that is possible, and we thought that it was not possible before. So you have to rely on science to give you indication if it's consistent with the whole conceptual apparatus and your whole theory. But you cannot just say, oh, the scientists say that, so that's the truth. Because they themselves will never say that. They will say, well, for now, that's what we know. It may change in the future. So I think that's what is very interesting to bring philosophy and psychology together. It's because anyway, we are all trying. And if we are several of us trying together, there is more hope that we'll eventually get to the truth.